speaker is our Deputy Leader, Mary White-TD. She is speaking on behalf of Carlow Kilkenny Greens, who have moved and had accepted a friendly amendment to Motion 3. Mary.
Delegates, I love Motion 2, I prefer Motion 3, and I adore the Carlow Kilkenny amendment. I have to declare my interest here. I drive a turbo pure plant oil car, grown on local produced biofuel in Carlow Kilkenny. But Mark is right. The whole idea of biofuels has moved on, and we should be looking now at a new policy for the Green Party. We should be looking at new technology, particularly in the area of lignocellulose. It's a fancy word, but all it means is you extract the starch and the sugar, not only from the crop itself, but from the stalk, the tops and the tail, so there's no waste. We should be looking at anaerobic digestion. We should be looking at flaring off methane to drive our cars on pig slurry. We should be looking at how we draft this policy to make sure that the poorest people of the world aren't suffering. Perhaps we can manage our own policy here in Ireland, but we as Greens, as part of a global movement, must make sure that people in other countries, whether it's in the Far East or the Near East, we must make sure that they are not dispossessed by the growth in biofuels. I ask you to support this motion because it is really so important, and particularly in light that we have to move towards 2010 with the EU Biofuel Directive, when 10% of all of our transport fuels will have to be in our cars. And I want to move today too that we should be prioritising biofuel in public service vehicles, that's taxis and hackneys, and also in public transport. It is really important for our economy that we produce a crop that will not damage our tillage land, will not damage the environment, and particularly in some of the new crops, whether it's sunflower, whether it's fodder beet or maize or sugar beet, that we are mindful of the energy inputs. And I know certainly that some of those crops have very low energy inputs, and I would ask you to support the motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Our next speaker is Councillor David Healy, Councillor for Howth, a member of Fingal County Council. David.
Thank you, Dan. This is a complicated question, but of course where it starts is climate change. And what we know now, even compared to, say, our discussions this time last year at our conference, is that climate change is an even more urgent problem than we had realised. The IPCC came out last year with its report, and by the summer the scientists were all pointing out that the increased melting in Greenland shows that they were under predictions, that things are a lot more urgent than we had previously believed. And climate change is about two things. It's about fossil fuels, but it's also about the natural carbon cycle. It's about the carbon stored in the soils, in the forests, especially in the peatlands, the carbon cycling into the sea. And it's very clear now that we need to do whatever we can to get the carbon into the natural system. We don't need to just reduce what we're putting into the atmosphere, but we need to actively be taking carbon out of the atmosphere. And I'd ask you to bear that in mind when we start talking about biofuels. Ethanol has already been discussed, and I won't go into much more details. Ethanol made from grain is not very good in terms of return on energy. It takes a lot of fossil energy in for the plant energy you get back out. But it was predicted before the oil prices went up that as soon as oil prices reached a certain level, that the food price would then be, because the ethanol link, the food price would then be tied to the oil prices. Sure enough, over the last 3 years, this is what we've seen. The oil prices have gone up and the food prices have connected up to them and followed them up. An appalling crisis for the poor of the world. To fill one SUV tank with ethanol requires as much grain as would feed one person for a year. So we are directly putting the people, the car-driving populations of the planet, that's us, are directly putting our transport in conflict with the food needs of the poor. Other biofuels, and it's quite right to have mentioned this, have a lot more potential. Palm oil, considered on its own, looks very positive. It's a perennial. It takes very little energy input for what you get back. But as has been pointed out, it's being grown on land being taken by displacing small farmers, and in fact it's been grown on rainforest land. The very worst thing we have done is we've deforested rainforest peatlands with the enormous release of peatland of greenhouse gases as a result. Grass leading to methane is an excellent potential. It's been shown to have a lot of potential for Ireland, that we could be using our grass directly into methane as a transport fuel. That one looks very good. Waste has already been mentioned. And possibly the most optimistic is the idea of carbon negative bioenergy. This is the idea of biochar, where you heat the biomass material, you get gases and liquid fuels out, and you get left with charcoal. The charcoal is the carbon. It can be put in the soil. It's good for the soil. We can actually have fuels which are involved in storing carbon out of the atmosphere. So there is a lot of potential. There's an enormous range between the different options, and we need a sophisticated policy which will address that. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Our next speaker, speaking against the motions, is Gary Fitzgerald from Dublin Central Greens. Gary.
I'm speaking against this motion this morning, and I'm speaking against it on the simple grounds of impossibility. And that is that what we're proposing to do, excuse me, I'm suffering from a bit of a cold, with biofuels is impossible. It is an inherent characteristic of biofuels that they compete with agricultural land for food. We wouldn't be here today discussing a review of Green Party nuclear policy because we know that it's an inherent characteristic of nuclear energy that it's both inherently dangerous and has this multi-generational toxic effect. Similarly, we can review our biofuels policy along the lines that was outlined by the previous speakers as much as we want, but the end point is going to be the same, and that is that we're going to come out against biofuels in the broad spectrum. Now, one of the reasons why biofuels are an attractive option for Ireland is because we have this temporary crisis in Irish agriculture, whereby it's cheaper to, in my constituency in Dublin Central, it's cheaper to buy beef flown in from Brazil and lamb reared in New Zealand than it is to buy similar products from Ireland. The only reason that that is the case is because of the plentiful supply of cheap oil. We all know from our understanding of peak oil that is, if it hasn't changed already, it's just about
There we interrupt our live coverage at this early stage of the annual conference of the Green Party for a special news bulletin.
The demand is up. The only way that supply is going is down. As a result, we're going to move into a new era of food scarcity. The food surpluses that we've had in the past are going to be no longer. We're going to have to press into service every bit of agricultural land that we can have in order to feed the growing populations of the world. So this temporary glitch, this temporary transition in Irish agriculture will fundamentally alter in the next couple of years. So a lot of the premises on which biofuels are made are incorrect. So what are the consequences then if we try to develop a biofuel economy or in some level a biofuel industry? Well, the consequences of that is that we will create a demand for biofuels. If we create a demand for biofuels, we know that we will fill that supply, and on the open market we will have rich Western consumers competing for food energy with the poor of the world. We will win in that open market because we have more money. We will use our money to buy that energy to drive around in our cars or in our buses, whereas the poor in the world won't be able to buy the energy that they need, not to fill the tanks in their cars, but to fill the stomachs in their bodies. So just like we wouldn't entertain a review of our nuclear policy based on false premises, we can't entertain a review of our biofuels policy based on these premises. The Green Party prides itself, and for me it's its distinctive characteristic, on long-term vision, on policies that are there designed for not short-term fix for rich backers, but for our communities, our species and even the world. And I urge the party to take a long-term view in this and oppose the motion.